Okay, Mimi, thanks very much. It's really my honor to be speaking in this forum, and I want to thank Barry, the SERC, and everybody who's online today, along with the many colleagues with whom I worked to develop the concepts that I'll be presenting today. I'm rapidly going to move to slide 3 for those of you who don't see the screen. Credit for many of the ideas in this talk go to the participants in the workshops on cyber social learning systems that I co-organized with my colleague Chuck Friedman in the Department of Learning Health Sciences at the University of Michigan. This workshop series was sponsored by the Computing Community Consortium, which is a standing committee of this Computing Research Association, funded by the National Science Foundation and advisory to the NSF, and charged with developing audacious new research ideas for the computer science community and for the broader communities with which it interacts. We had nearly 100 participants in a series of 3 workshops that I ran. You can find links to the CCC workshop series by Googling cyber social learning systems online. This talk is based on my own preliminary personal draft of a report coming out of that series of workshops. This is not an official report of this series of workshops. Blame for any shortcomings in this report rests with me. Many of the ideas in this report, however, came from other people who were involved in those workshops. Next slide, number 4. So we envision a class of radically new socio-technical systems. We're calling them cyber social learning systems. These are human-intent, socially complex, often ultra-large-scale systems. They're the systems that provide the most critical services to us and to our economy and our society. In the future, these systems in healthcare, in education, in defense, in community services, policing, law enforcement, criminal justice, and so on and so forth, will be deeply infused with computing technology and information processes. Everything you read about, sensing, big data, machine learning, AI, distributed computing, cloud and mobile systems, and increasingly decentralization through decentralizing platforms. These systems will not only automate, but they will reflect, project, and predict in order to learn and adapt rapidly to achieve very high levels of fitness for purpose in the sectors in which they operate. They will span many scales of learning, from individuals and pairs of people to groups, enterprises, whole sectors of the economy, and to society at large. Again, these systems will transform defense, healthcare, education, government, city and community services, and all of the other sectors that I've talked about. I believe that the future of systems is really one of cyber social learning systems. Next slide, number 5. This slide gives a graphic example of one person's vision of what this concept might look like, specialized to the domain of healthcare delivery systems. This is a graphic of a national scale learning health system. It's organized around governance mechanisms, mechanisms for patient engagement, design of systems to foster and generate trust, to gather data from many sources, many different kinds of sources across the health sector, from research institutes and public health agencies to the hospitals that are delivering health care to integrated delivery systems that will analyze this data, learn from this data, and derive interventions back into the system that are meant to drive it to ever higher states of fitness for purpose. Next slide. The reality today, however, is that notwithstanding promising islands of excellence, we're really not on a path to build such systems. I personally believe we're not even well configured to get on a path to building this kind of system today. There are many small examples, isolated examples, where learning is happening, where systems are improving quickly, but for the most part, the kinds of systems that I've been talking about are slow, they're not learning very fast, and they're vastly underperforming their potential. We need new solutions because the problems that we face in this area can no longer wait. Next slide, number 7. So first I want to talk about the nature of the problem, and I'm going to channel my colleague Bill Griswold's analysis here by considering 2 vastly different cultures, the New World culture of computing and the Old World culture of service systems. Next slides. Let's talk about slide 8. Let's talk about the culture of computing. We in this field have computing and systems engineering generally, we've experienced an unbelievable phenomenon of sustained exponential improvement in computing, storage, sensing, and connectivity sustained over many decades. We're thus living with a culture of plenty, of speed, customizability, personalization, and connectedness. We almost take it all for granted. This transformation has revolutionized essentially all information-intensive industries, so think finance, music, entertainment. It's now revolutionizing physical systems, think cyber-physical systems, robotics, Internet of Things, things made out of atoms. It's creating amazing new functionality as we migrate from a kind of the age of cell phones to an age of digital assistants, digital collaborators, coaches, and even mediators who help us to connect with each other and relate in productive ways. But all of this is now running headlong into human and social systems and phenomena at scale. And so this little graphic you see on your screen, this gradient, represents the deep impact that computing has had on information systems, the impact it's now having on the world of things, and it's still fairly light impact on the kinds of human and social intensive systems that I want to talk about today. So next slide. Now let's consider the culture of old world service systems. We're talking healthcare, education, government, including things like procurement, for example. These systems are still substantially lacking meaningful, integrated, and deeply analyzed data. They lack shared, effective modern data and computing infrastructure. They're often unscientific in the use of what limited data are available. Take, for example, the idea that you measure your blood pressure once a year when you visit the doctor, and compare that with the concept of a Nyquist frequency for reconstructing the signal that's intended to be measured by that intervention. It doesn't make sense. It's not scientific. These systems are not really organized to learn from experience. They're learning far too slowly, if at all. They're woefully underperforming, and in many cases, they're even getting worse. Let me give you some statistics. While computing has gotten millions, arguably billions of times better since the early 1960s, obesity rates in the United States have gone from 10 to 50% of the population, and the cost of healthcare has gone from 5 to 18% of GDP. That's unbelievable. Deaths by avoidable medical errors are estimated to be occurring at rates up to 400,000 people a year. That's multiple jetliners full of people going down every single day. And serious injuries are occurring at rates estimated 5 to 20 times that. You're talking up to 8 million people a year being seriously injured by avoidable medical errors. We've spent $30 billion+ in recent years on interoperable electronic health record systems, and yet, with few exceptions, we've gotten close to no real interoperation across at a national scale as was initially envisioned. In 2015, in the educational sector, only 25% of high school seniors are proficient in math, only 37% in reading, and that's actually down from 2013. And we're all broadly familiar with dysfunction in major government systems, including many procurement processes and systems. These are the systems that are eating us alive economically, politically, and socially. And these are the kinds of systems where we need new solutions if we're to recover to healthy states of societal fitness. So on to the next slide, slide number 10. Let's talk about computing solutions. The culture of computing wants its qualities for these kinds of human systems. So for example, in healthcare, we envision continuous sensing of physiology, of psychic and sleep status, of social status, generating improved situation awareness and radical transparency to key phenomena like how's my weight, how's my blood pressure, how's my sleep. We want to induce healthy individual and organizational behaviors across the board for people, teams, firms, societies that analyze, envision, explore, learn, and improve. We all want to be healthy. We all want to be fit. So the idea then is to make all these old world systems perform like new world computing systems. So one idea, just apply computer science and systems thinking to the problem and we'll be done. We'll leverage advances in sensors, mobile cloud computing, AI, alerting. For example, instead of taking blood pressure once a year, we'll take it every hour or a minute or second. Now we maybe are approaching a Nyquist frequency where we can properly reconstruct that signal. We'll inform subjects in real time when they need to improve their diet, their exercise, their sleep. And we'll do this for millions of people and gather data at scale using mobile and cloud computing. We'll learn from that data, we'll monetize it, we'll grow and achieve better health outcomes. Next slide. So on this slide, I give a conceptual architecture for your typical health app. It's basically a control loop. blood pressure is 142/90. A sensor gives a reading, maybe 143/89. That's fed into kind of a feedback control system that says, okay, your blood pressure is 23/9 too high. We'll convert that into a piece of advice. The advice is eat less, exercise more. This kind of thing runs on a cell phone, for example, and communicates with the cloud, and voila, in due time, the blood pressure goes down to 122/81 and all is well. Well, that's a very nice story, but unfortunately, it doesn't really work out very well. There are tens of thousands of health apps in app stores, and they're almost all useless. Why? Well, this is where we begin to move into this notion underlying cyber-social learning systems. One big problem is that this story assumes a control theory paradigm for people, but people are not machines, and treating them as such generally fails. When the plant is human or organizational or social, you have to deal with it not as a machine that can be driven by actuators, but as a system that has cravings, values, competition, corruption, economics, incentives, objectives, power, psychological fear and reward systems that's irrational, biased, where cognitive dissonance prevents it from learning things that are at odds with what it already believes. A system that has intentionality, agency, ideology, norms, culture, history, laws, responsibility, social networks, treachery, creativity, learning, fatigue, illness, forgetfulness. We're talking about deeply human systems. We're not talking about machines. And in these systems, people are profoundly also affected by their environment. So what they eat may not be based as much on what their cell phone is telling them as to whether there are cookies on their shelves. So the bottom line here is that the principles underlying notions of kind of traditional notions of computer science, systems engineering, cyber-physical systems, concepts such as control theory and dynamics are really fundamentally inadequate for dealing with the human and social domain. Next slide. This is a computer graphic, and I'm sorry for people who aren't online, but if you really want to take a kind of a control loop view of learning and improvement in these systems, this is sort of what it's going to have to look like. At the bottom of this diagram, we have a representation of the plant to be controlled, and it's a human and socio-technical system now. It's not just a machine. It lives in a physical environment rich with artifacts and tools and resources. It involves people and institutions, their services, workflows and performance, tacit knowledge, values, all of the things that I just talked about. It's also cut through with cyber-physical systems infrastructure, cell phones, cloud computing, various sensors, robots, manufacturing systems, and with sensing of human phenomena, with technologies for communication, for coordination, electronic social networking, and so on and so forth. That's the system that you now have to sense. That's the system from which you need to gather and analyze data. That's a system for which you need to plan interventions and execute those interventions in order to drive that system to higher states of fitness. So the questions are, what kind of models enable you to do that? What kind of data do you need to collect? How do you do simulations for these kinds of systems? What sort of evidence do you gather to make justified judgments about what's going to work for these sorts of systems? Next slide. Slide 15. So we often lack physics-like system models for human and social things, for human and social phenomena. Interventions are not just adjustments to actuators. They often don't have deterministic effects, and they do have unexpected and undesirable side effects. The plant to be quote-unquote controlled here is not just a machine, but it's smart and constantly learning and changing. And it's subject to diverse and complex disturbances. The effectiveness of feedback can be highly sensitive to local conditions. The concept of a set point or an objective is fraught. Who sets the goals for these systems? And so CS, systems engineering, CPS thinking, all vitally important for these systems, but really, really woefully inadequate for dealing with these systems. Next slide, number 16. So the goals of an initiative in cyber-social learning systems are both short-term and long-term. In the short term, we're looking together to bring together a much broader diversity of disciplines to identify audacious aims for the healthcare system, for education, for example, and to outline a research agenda to establish conceptual foundations and principles for analyzing, developing, operating, integrating, and evolving cyber-social learning systems across many scales and for many sectors. Critical to this entire vision is the integration of perspectives and knowledge from many other fields. basic fields, including computer science and systems engineering, but also the social, behavioral, and economic sciences, the humanities, to which we need to look for ethics, for example, architecture, policy, law, business, applied fields such as implementation science and service science, and domain-specific fields such as healthcare, education, and defense. Over the long term, our goal is to catalyze a self-reinforcing transformation of all of these critical sectors into dramatically better performing cyber-social learning systems. Systems that reflect on what they're doing based on data, systems that simulate possible futures, systems that run experiments in order to determine what will work, and that then effect adaptation to improve performance markedly over time. So that's my quick introduction. The rest of this talk is really in two parts. Meeting these goals will require multiple paradigm shifts. So I'm going to talk about 9 of those paradigm shifts. And I believe, and we believe, CSLS, cyber social learning systems, will include all the traditional elements of architecture and assurance and so on and so forth, but that there will also be many innovative and unprecedented concerns that have to be dealt with if we're to realize the vision that I've talked about here. So I'm now on slide 18. These are the 9 paradigm shifts that I want to talk about. A shift in emphasis from machines, which is mostly what we as engineers think about, to people and social structures and dynamics. We already do this, of course, in systems engineering. We talk about systems, man, and cybernetics. In computer science, we have human-computer interaction and computer-supported collaborative work, but the preponderance of our focus is really on quantitative, mechanistic systems, and that's pretty easy to see. It's what we're trained to do, it's what we're good at, and it's where our emphasis generally lies. Second paradigm shift, a shift from control theory concepts to notions of influence over people and organizations. A third shift from explicit knowledge to tacit know-how. A fourth shift from notions of management to notions of politics, a variant of this shift from control to influence. And I'll talk about each of these in a little more detail. A shift from centralized to decentralized systems, even going so far as to the vision of the group of people out there called crypto-anarchists. It's worth looking at what they're doing. A shift from building and exploiting proprietary knowledge stocks to participating voluntarily in large-scale open knowledge flows. A shift from racing against smart machines to racing with them against other people who are also racing with smart machines. A shift from notions of optimization to weaker notions of adaptation, hedging, and even just acceptance. And a shift, ultimately, from disciplinary research to convergent research, bringing together many of the kinds of sources of knowledge that I've talked about: computing, systems, social, behavioral, and economic sciences, humanities, art, policy, law, and so on and so forth. Slide 19. So let's talk about some of these shifts. The first one I want to talk about is the shift from machines to human social in what we emphasize. As I've said, we've always known that it's about both, but we tend to focus and develop principles that are better suited to machines than to people. So cyber physical systems, for example, is rooted in principles having to do with real-time systems, sensors, and control theory. Software engineering is rooted in logic, formal representations, and algorithms. Systems engineering emphasizes optimization, control, formal models. If you look at the 2017 International Conference on Software Engineering, and its research track was about documentation, program analysis, concurrency, software refactoring, dependability, search-based software engineering, software processes, testing, and mobile app security. These are fundamentally all principally technological issues and don't really deal with the complexities of the social and human environments in which we now need to build systems. And when we as engineers do deal with people, we often model them through a technical lens, making simplifying assumptions such as people are economic optimizers. Next slide, a shift from control theory to influence theory, if you will. The question is, if you can't control people to change their behavior, well, what can you do? And the idea here is you need to understand influence. One example is B.J. Fogg's notion of a behavior triggering, which he graphs in a motivation difficulty plane, if you will. If something is really hard and you're not motivated to do it, you're not going to act. If something you're strongly motivated, or if you're not strongly motivated and it's hard, you're not going to do it. If you are strongly motivated and it's easy, you act. So there's some kind of dividing line across the threshold of which behavior change happens. That gives you the beginning of a notion of some kind of model of what it takes to drive behavior change. And so we're talking about exploiting fields like behavioral economics, which looks at psychological, cognitive, social, emotional insights to help and explain real behavior in individuals. We might be looking at fields like mechanism design if we want to understand what motivates the behavior of institutions. So cyber-social systems theory will require an integration of computing and systems engineering with models and theories from the social, behavioral, economic sciences, humanities, and the arts, and so on and so forth. So I've listed at the bottom of this slide a couple of important references that you might look at if you want to pursue this any further. I'm going to go on to the next slide, number 21. Another paradigm shift from an emphasis on formalizing explicit knowledge to kind of driving the generation of tacit know-how. John Seeley Brown asks, how do you turn left on a bicycle? How do you know how to do this? I mean, you do know how to do this, but how do you know what to do? How do you turn left on a bicycle? Do you turn the wheel to the left? The answer is no. So tacit knowledge can actually foster bad mental models of what it takes to accomplish certain results. The answer is to turn left, you have to first turn the wheel to the right. This is important especially if, like JSB, you're an extreme motorcyclist who might drive at high speeds at a barrier and try to avoid hitting them at the very last minute. If you want to turn left, you have to know that you have to turn the wheel to the right first in order to get the bike to lean to the left, at which point you can then bring the wheels around. So critical to learning are notions of unlearning, of frame breaking, of generating new lenses and new insights into how to get stuff done. Cyber-social learning systems is ultimately about system performance, not about propositional knowledge. Learning is more like learning to play the piano, learning to perform, than learning that some proposition is true about something in the world. Computer science is largely focused on explicit propositional knowledge representation and reasoning with it, and that's still absolutely a key. But people, groups, enterprises, sectors, and society must also unlearn old and learn how to perform in new and better ways. And we need a theory about how to exploit technology to make all that happen. Next slide, a shift from management to politics. This is Doug Van Houweling's notion that computing enables extraordinarily high impact, highly distributed autonomous action. Just think about what the internet did for the world. And yet such actions don't always aggregate to positive social outcomes. The lack of consensus value in such systems can drive divisions, conflict, and strife, and of course we're seeing that in spades around the internet today. We have debates about individual freedom versus public safety around guns, strong encryption versus the dark web and terrorism. So at the scale of systems that we're talking about, traditional engineering management challenges are really turned into political challenges. And this is something that now has to be dealt with systematically in the conception of, the design of, the operation and evolution of large-scale cyber-social learning systems. Scaled solutions have to be designed so that, on average, they positively aggregate autonomous initiatives from the participants in these systems. Incentive structures, mechanism designs now become architectural elements, fundamental parts of the designs of these systems. Governance becomes a major and potentially the very largest challenge in the engineering, if you will, of cyber-social learning systems. Next slide, number 23. A shift from centralized control to healthy emergence. Traditional engineering uses centralized design management. We have architect builders, architect integrators, with prime contractors. Somebody's always in charge of the system. But that's not going to work at the scale that we're talking about. And we can already see that the world is moving much more toward very large-scale platforms that foster disintermediation, the elimination of centralized controls, and the emergence of kind of self-organized initiatives based on voluntary participation and self-interest. So years ago, we saw the emergence of peer-to-peer communication platforms like Napster that more or less disrupted the entire music industry. Everybody's familiar today with peer-to-peer networks like peer-to-peer payment networks like Bitcoin, but they're not really peer-to-peer if you depend on centralized brokers like Coinbase. Well, what's really interesting today is you're now seeing the emergence of completely decentralized exchanges for Bitcoin and a completely decentralized cryptographically secure marketplaces that bypass any kind of central organization in such spaces. So Coinbase goes away, Silk Road, a centralized broker, that kind of thing is no longer necessary. People can really genuinely just download open source software, run it on their own computers, and live in a world of complete peer-to-peer decentralized self-organized systems. Talon's Urbit system is a new vision of a decentralized network of servers. You can go read about it on the web. And in places like China and India, you see incredible innovation around open production design and distribution networks. And these are networks and platforms that enable the participation of tens or hundreds of thousands of different companies to build and distribute products in response to rapidly emerging new demands. So question, how do we design the transformational platforms of the future to incentivize participation, effective governance, and emergence of healthy cyber-social learning systems at scale? What would such platforms look like for healthcare, for education, for defense, for procurement? I mean, for those on the line who are in the field of procurement, what would it mean to build a cyber-social learning system at scale for procurement processes? What would it take to make that work? Next slide, number 24. Another transformation. This is John Seeley Brown and John Hagel's notion of a transformation from a focus on knowledge stocks to knowledge flows. Today, most enterprises, particularly in the West, continue to emphasize the creation, protection, and exploitation of proprietary, authoritative knowledge assets. The emphasis is on scalable efficiency, and yet if you look at the return on assets for public companies in the United States, it's collapsed by 75% since 1965. That's amazing, and it shows no signs of improving anytime soon. The idea here is that there's going to be a shift, which you're already seeing in places like India and China, to a new model that involves participation in open knowledge flows at scale. Main centers, again, of institutional innovation of this kind are now in India and China. The idea is, you know, through various platforms, participate in these networks. You participate in more and more diverse knowledge flows, and you're ready when something is needed to jump in and collaborate in order to get it done. These scalable platforms are enabling the pull of knowledge and expertise and skills from tens or even hundreds of thousands of peers, and it's absolutely revolutionizing the production of everything from clothes to motorcycles to IT products, but again, mostly not in the West, but in the emerging nations of the future. Another paradigm shift from racing against to racing with AI machines. Again, this is John Seeley Brown's formulation. We're on the verge of a new symbiotic relationship between people and computation. People think of opposition to machines, so Kasparov playing against Deep Blue in a chess match, pitting human intelligence against machine intelligence. And yet, if you look at what people are doing in freestyle chess, it's a person plus a chess computer playing against another person and a chess computer. So it's human-machine teams now playing against each other, where the humans are still in control of ultimate decision-making, but where they're aided by AI in figuring out what to do next. This kind of dynamics has increased the level of chess play to really unprecedented heights, achieving both tactical and strategic excellence, and it's helped people to really gain insight into the game and into human-machine teaming. As a DoD example, General Stanley Crystal changed the Iraq JSOC from running about 10 ops per month to 10 ops per night by making people responsible for context and decision-making, and AI machines for helping with intel, analytics, ISR, and so on and so forth. So it looks like we genuinely are on the threshold of a new kind of human-machine symbiosis that will free people to focus on context, imagination, and decision-making while leaving the machines handling the things that machines are good at. And those are different than the things that people are good at, and that's why the symbiosis is needed. Bill Rouse has emphasized various ways of learning and the circumstances under which they're important. So traditionally engineered systems often assume that objectives, dynamics, and constraints are measurable and tractable, in which case optimization is a good way to proceed in system design. Much of software engineering, contemporary software development, throws out the idea that those things are tractable, but software development teams can move faster than the environment changes, and so what software development teams do now is they sense the environment by interacting with customers at high frequency and by instrumenting their products to send telemetry back to the mothership, so that the software development organizations can adapt faster than the dynamics of the environments in which their software products are used. That has made a complete transformational change in the way that software is built. So now we build software in an agile manner, adapting to changes in an environment that we can't really fully understand a priori. When that doesn't work, when there are multiple viable, projectable alternative futures plausible, then one can use a hedging strategy, building real options into system designs through mechanisms like information hiding modularity, so that you have the right but not an obligation to make certain kinds of changes to your systems in the future should future conditions evolve along certain lines. And of course, if none of this is realistic, then you can simply accept the way that the world is and move on. The next and last of these paradigm shifts that I want to discuss is a shift from disciplinarity to convergence. We've already talked about it. The problems that we're talking about simply can't be addressed from within any single discipline. Computer science doesn't have the answers, systems engineering doesn't have the answers, sociology doesn't have the answers, law doesn't have the answers. This is not a field for the policy people to solve. It's going to take pulling from all of these fields in order to assemble the kinds of knowledge and insights that are needed to build the systems of the future. Unfortunately, the structure of disciplines today is countervailing against this kind of multidisciplinarity, and I list a few reasons here why that's the case. Cross-cutting funding and the kind of workshops that I'm reporting on here are helpful, but not nearly sufficient. We did actually have people from medicine, from law, from political science, from healthcare and education, along with systems engineering and computer science there, and it's wonderful, but it's not going to get the job done. The key insight here is that we haven't really explored how to use all this new technology and research methods to integrate across disciplines for convergent research. So we're talking about platforms that are being used in places like China to integrate tens of thousands of companies with different bodies of knowledge and expertise. Shouldn't we be able to do something like that to begin to integrate across disciplines to address the kinds of problems we're dealing with now in our society? So that's where I'll leave this notion of paradigm shifts. I know I'm talking kind of fast. We got started a little bit late, but I'm going to now move on to the next topic, which is just to survey some of the key aspects of cybersocial learning systems. And I believe I have 7 here. So we'll start again with this notion of multidisciplinary pull. We'll talk a little bit about design, architecture, and emergence, platforms and infrastructure, human and social feedback in learning loops, governance models and mechanisms, assurance of critical properties for cybersocial learning systems, and how to build new research communities, aims, methods, and results. I'm now on slide 29. So let's spend a few minutes talking about multidisciplinarity. As I've said, fragmentation of research is rife today. We need some kind of cross-community transactive memory system, some way of motivating voluntary participation from many disciplines in new kinds of platforms that allow for the integration of knowledge to respond to new and emerging opportunities. We need to build bridges between computer science, systems engineering, social behavioral and economic sciences, and all of the other kinds of disciplines that I've talked about. And again, I think that a really interesting proposition is that we can think about building cyber-social learning systems to enable the construction of principles for cyber-social learning systems for all other fields. The first step is to enable new kinds of research. Next slide, 30. I'm going to skip over this slide very quickly. It says that, you know, in the past we've attempted many times to foster multidisciplinarity. We have many initiatives going on now, including in my own engineering school, where, for example, cyber physical systems technology is recognized as a cross-cutting discipline that integrates many fields. But we really haven't explored how to use technology to fundamentally change how a much broader range of disciplines will be structured. How do we pull together computer science from UVA with systems engineering from USC and healthcare from Carnegie Mellon University and policy and law from you know, some other institution? We don't have the platforms, the mechanisms, the governance structures, the incentive systems to do that today. So next slide, again on multidisciplinarity. We need new foundations for acquiring, relating, and using models drawn from knowledge housed in multiple but still largely siloed disciplines. System models are at the heart of any feedback-driven or learning system. Learning is captured to a significant degree in evolving and computable models of what's known. But we have to augment physics-like models with models of human and social phenomena, and these models will be learned from data. In many cases, they'll be contingent, and they will have to be based on insights from disciplines with which we're not substantially involved today. So, for example, behavioral economics or cognitive psychology or sociology, anthropology, policy, and law. How do we develop, validate, integrate, and evolve the use of these kinds of models to underpin cyber-social learning systems at scale? Next slide, architecture. I want to talk briefly about a couple of elements of architectures of these systems. Of course, we have data and computation, but we also have human and social intervention mechanisms. What does it take to drive behavioral change in a hospital system, for example? There are, in fact, fields now that are set up to understand how to answer that question. If you Google the field of implementation design, you'll find that there are people out there who are trying to understand organizational change in healthcare delivery systems. We need architectures now will include, therefore, computable models of human and social phenomena, often built from data and used to understand what's going on in systems and in order to plan and justify interventions into those systems. The architectures of cyber-social learning systems will include communication coordination platforms with governance and oversight systems. They will sense not only physical but now human and social phenomena. They'll use not just single-loop learning but double-loop learning and adaptation, where even the goals of the system are subject to evolution over time. And they will support not only stores of knowledge, but flows of knowledge and even waves of propagating updates to knowledge spreading across large cyber-social ecosystems. The architectures of such large systems will need ecosystem governors and stabilizers. Nancy Levison's work on STAMP, for example, is a nice model to look at to see how the air transport system in the United States is governed and stabilized, and what kinds of information flows extend from the federal government down through contractors over to the operational side of air transport and back up to the regulatory agencies and ultimately to Congress and the executive branch. Crucially, cyber-social learning systems will need to focus on human and social forces and glue. These are terms that I've just made up, but what is it that induces voluntary participation in these systems? What is it that resolves political conflicts and enables people to work together in these systems? How do you guarantee that a cyber-social learning system comprising a network of defense contractors, for example, is on board with a set of core value propositions that assure that that ecosystem will remain healthy and deliver results to the DoD and to the American people? The architectures of these systems will now include consideration of catalysts for healthy emergence. So looking at network effects and exploiting that, looking at mechanism designs and exploiting them to make these systems work. These become fundamental architectural issues. And of course, you're going to need some way of doing continuous assurance of critical properties for learning systems at scale. We do not know how to do that today, and it's something that is going to require considerable attention. The next topic, we can think of architectures of cyber-social systems as compositions of social components. So on this slide, I have in bold components, in italics, connecting relationships, underlined notions of dynamics, and in purple font, notions of metrics. So here's just an example of one way to think about these systems as compositions of social components. Governments regulate and journalists review and report on, professionals, managers, researchers, designers, analysts, and others, threatened by malicious actors, while providing service to and obtaining feedback from stakeholders, patients, nurses, administrators, passengers, students, soldiers, all of whom are enabled and required or incented to participate in technology-mediated value co-production processes, evolving, there's dynamics, to track high states of fitness, there's a metric, relative to changing objectives. Next slide, 34. Cyber-social system platforms and infrastructures. We've talked about it already, and we see it happening largely again in some other parts of the world, where the key to enabling a cyber-social learning system to thrive is large-scale distributed learning doing fabrics, if you will, to use John Seeley Brown's terminology, that capture context and actions for purposes of enabling these systems to reflect on how they're doing, to learn how to do better, and to store and record what they've learned and what they know. Every piece of data in such systems ought to be contextualized, citable, and machine-checkably interpretable. Data flows instantly and seamlessly through evolving data science pipelines to all of its many uses and stakeholders in such a system. These systems will support automated discovery, analysis, and relationship finding. They'll integrate devices, computing, and human actions and interactions, and they'll model discovery as creating and updating of contextualized digital assets. The key question, looking at this quotation at the bottom of the slide, is not whether the architecture of the cyber-social learning system is social or technical. That's putting it the wrong way around. As Jeff Bowker said, the question is whether we choose a primarily social or a technical solution or some combination. And it's the distribution of solutions that support infrastructure in different ways at different moments. So as systems engineers, as computer scientists, and as others involved in this, this new field, we need to fully embrace this notion that we're now in a design space that's quite new and different than any that we've really had to deal with before. Next slide, on interaction and governance. Communication and coordination infrastructure, as I've said, is going to be absolutely critical. And you can think of several different dimensions of this. Ben Schneiderman points out the need for deliberative system design tools for thousands or even millions of participants, large-scale teamwork monitoring and improvement systems. How does that play out in DoD procurement? Collaboration toolkits and remote teamwork systems and online forecasting and dispute resolution tools. We need governance systems and mechanisms, ways of setting objectives and making trade-offs. Who gets to do this in a city, for example, where investments in smart city technology may privilege some parts of a community over others? We need to think very seriously about issues of responsibility and its allocation to people and institutions across these systems, and accountability. Who's responsible for reporting on events? How do we deal with enforcing consequences, rewards and penalties for good and bad behaviors in such systems? And what mechanisms do we put in place to control large-scale system behaviors around issues of safety, security, privacy, regulatory compliance, and so on and so forth? We can look at the history of the internet to see how some governance mechanisms have worked out well, and I would point to IETF as one example. On to slide 36. So evidence-based assurance of cybersocial learning systems. Going to be absolutely critical. These, again, are societally essential systems that deliver services on which we depend, not just for happiness, but for our lives. And so Bill Shirless, Lee Osterweil, Lori Clark, and others in these workshops focused on some of these issues. And some proposed that we can think of evidence-based assurance in at least 3 dimensions of process, evidence, and what we're going to do with AI and big data, machine learning, and all of that. So in terms of process, we have assurance considerations. We have to consider assurance at the outset and continually during the operation of these systems. How do we do this for the kinds of systems at scale that we're talking about? If you think back to the early picture of a nationwide learning health system linking a diversity of different institutions, how does one protect that against hackers? How does one assure that that system is operating safely in the interest of patients and society? We need concurrent production of design artifacts, propositions, and evidentiary structures to support them, safety cases, if you will, for key components, at least, of cybersocial learning systems. And we need governance, community cybersocial processes to manage the evolution of frameworks, platforms, API models, data models, process invariants, and so on for these systems. With respect to evidence, we're going to be looking at an enormous diversity of kinds of evidentiary data, both formal and informal, including just expert human judgments, results of software testing, proofs of theorems, data from test and evaluation of physical systems, and all manner of data. We need dependency models and argumentation structures that connect all of this evidence and allow us to make well-justified judgments about properties of these systems. And we need analytic models for hazard safety, security threats, compliance, and so on and so forth. With respect to AI, we need algorithms that not only empirically tend to perform well, but that can actually explain themselves, models for reasoning about all of that, and very importantly, the integration of traditional systems and safety engineering with the fields in computing and systems engineering that are developing and employing all of this kind of AI technology. Those 2 disciplines have not come together yet, and the time is ripe. So next slide. I'm going to talk just for 1 more minute about learning. I'll go over this very quickly. We need greatly elaborated analysis of learning to underpin a theory of cybersocial learning systems. It's much more than education. It's much more than machine learning. We have to understand how people, how institutions, how societies learn and evolve. Next slide, 38. So for example, we might start with theories of human learning and posit whether and how these distinctions operate in a healthcare system, in a smart city, and so on and so forth. Again, I'm going to let you read over this slide and move on to the next slide, again about learning and about machine learning. The promise of this vision is not just that it exploits knowledge from many disciplines, but that it changes the way that it changes what individual disciplines do. So a really nice example from Lise Couture was about machine learning. Data from social phenomena are multimodal, multi-relational, spatiotemporal, multimedia, and so on and so forth. But most machine learning techniques today assume tabular and independent and identically distributed data sets. In other words, the assumptions of today's machine learning technologies are not necessarily very well applicable to the kinds of data that we're now talking about. And so embracing and participating in the field of cyber-social learning systems has the potential to really change the way that many other disciplines work, because they'll be confronted with different kinds of problems and different technical challenges. So I'm on to the last slide. Cyber-social learning systems. I believe it's the future of systems. We need to solve these problems. We need to solve them now. They're eating us alive. They include government, they include DOD, they include criminal justice, smart cities, education, healthcare, defense. In healthcare, for example, could such systems reduce deaths and morbidity from avoidable medical errors by 10x within 20 years? That's a cool challenge. At the end of our series of workshops, a report from one speaker went like this: there's a growing sense of enthusiasm and discussion within the room that it was starting to feel like we're not in Kansas anymore. Once you put all these pieces in the same design constellation, we're looking at something that felt pretty different. Well, I hope to have conveyed to you today, albeit at kind of high speed, why some people felt like we're now looking at a real phase transition in the world of systems, from separate old and new world service and computing systems to a future of high-performing cyber-social learning systems. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin, for a really super guided tour through an incredibly complex but incredibly important to our future set of challenges. Mimi, do we have people with questions for Kevin?
Sorry, yes, I had myself muted. Actually, I turned this over to Jack because it's been great reading the sort of running logs of notes that he had posted. So, Jack, I'm going to unmute you right now.
Well, yes, the question is, if we move from management to what should we move to? And my question is, should we move to facilitating mutual goal setting among the human beings?
Well, that is absolutely, I think, a right way to think about this. We need to move from kind of centralized top-down control thinking to negotiated, self-organized sets of shared value propositions around which that are necessary and sufficient to get stuff done. Just one very quick example. You know, we spent $35 billion or more on interoperability of electronic health record systems, but got substantially no interoperation. And that's because the enabling legislation mandated interoperable health record technology, but didn't do anything about the value propositions that would foster voluntary participation and sharing in this space. So what you point to is absolutely right, and it goes to this notion of kind of double loop learning, where we're learning not only how to optimize what we're doing, but how to set new goals.
Excellent, because we see exactly the same thing now in the new federal approach to cybersecurity of our critical infrastructure.
Cybersecurity is another place where absolutely these ideas are fundamentally applicable. If we want to build resilience to attack, we're going to have to be able to pull from many sources of knowledge and information at very high rates of speed in order to assemble responses to creative and highly effective attacks on our system. Systems. Just automating responses is not going to be enough.
Thank you.
Kevin, it seems like that one of the things that is needed to negotiate these complex, multidimensional things is some way to get the people who are compatible with each other together. That one thing that we tried to do with win-win negotiation was to create something called a portable context that basically said, yeah, here are my skills. I prefer specifics to generalities. I'm good at math and computer science and weak on medical. Here's my Myers-Briggs profile. I'm curiosity-driven and like interruptions, or I'm closure-driven and I want to get rid of a discussion item before we leap around to something else. this turned out to be somewhat helpful, but really hard to get your arms around. Do you know of any other kind of things like that that are going on?
Well, I think that one of the things that we and perhaps DOD might take a look at would be some of these very innovative new design and production networks at scale emerging in some of the cities in China around system design in industries like clothing and motorcycle manufacturing, because they do engage tens of thousands of institutions with different kinds of knowledge, so that when a new demand arises, you can actually pull from all of those sources in ways that are effective. I think we should go look at what these places are doing to get some insight into how this is already being done to very powerful effect in some of the nations that we care about. In terms of logistics of distribution, India is a place where they have tremendous distribution issues and are doing lots of innovation around open distribution. So I would go look at what systems are operating in these sorts of places as a source of insight.
Yeah, it's sort of interesting to compare what India's problems are given their infrastructure compared to what Amazon can do with distribution and things like that. So it seems like what may work in India may not work here, and vice versa, and that sort of thing.
Well, that's for sure. And centralized mechanisms like Amazon may not actually be the future. They may be a stepping stone toward a much more decentralized approach to some of this. And that's what these new platforms are fostering, again, in places like India and China. I personally think that we ought to be looking at how these platforms might support rapid assembly of responses in DoD settings, not just in procurement, but on the operational side of things. And I believe that our adversaries are probably also studying how these new kinds of institutional arrangements can support a much more agile, resilient, and adaptive kind of defense capability.
Yeah, that sounds like some good direction to go. Any other suggestions or comments or questions?
Yes, Daniel Appel had a question, and Daniel, you're unmuted, so feel free to directly ask if you'd like. Or I can just read out of the Q&A log. One of the assumptions that seems present is that once the passive architecture of big data systems is sufficiently inoperable, the automation will leverage Moore's law until it becomes seamless in the human sense. But can governance actually keep up with the unintended consequences in instances such as this?
Well, I think that's an excellent question. It's not clear that the answer is yes, unless, and if one looks at what's been happening around Facebook recently, you see some highly unexpected and arguably socially concerning consequences around the development of that technology, absent any kind of governance. What seems necessary, if not sufficient, is a systematic treatment of governance as a fundamental architectural component of these systems, so they're no longer just technical, but they are managed in ways that, again, assure that decentralized decisions aggregate to the benefit of society or the stakeholders in these systems. So I'm not optimistic that we know the answers yet, but clearly we need to be very concerned about this issue as we build these systems. As Doug Van Houweling said, governance may be the biggest issue in the future of cyber social learning systems. And I would just point to questions again around cryptographically secure peer-to-peer communication systems and the interests of governments. I mean, it's just unclear how we're going to resolve that governance issue in an effective manner. And so, yes, your point is very well taken.
Jack Ring here. I suggested if governance is done in a distributed and chaotic manner, then it may work.
Yes, I agree with that. You know, we can look to how governance is handled in everything from open source development to you know, to these peer-to-peer you know, Bitcoin exchanges. There are some to financial networks. But clearly, we need interesting new models for governance in these systems.
Question.
Oh, sorry, I just noted that you had made a comment. It looked like in reference to slide 35 of governance or immune system, and I was just curious what you meant.
Yes, one of the things that we're now looking at is instead of the notion of governance as something that's done to a system, one might better design the system to include an immune system.
Oh.
The human body, the health of the human body is not governed externally very effectively compared to what it does internally with pathogens.
Jack, I endorse heartily this notion. I think that you know, we can be misguided into a view of governance as kind of you know, a room full of people that sits outside of a giant nationwide integrated healthcare or defense system, for example. The reality is that these systems are going to be hierarchical, fractal, networked, and I think what you'll see are various mechanisms for governance at different temporal, spatial, organizational scales. You'll have to have that, and eventually some of that governance will be implemented in autonomic responses, particularly in areas where the dynamics have to be faster than people are capable of handling on their own, such as in the face of certain kinds of security attacks on network systems.
Jack, one other thing you mentioned was looking at Hegelian thinking. Is this trying to create syntheses from theses and antitheses, or some other kind of Hegelian thinking?
Yes, I detected in our education and even in our research, we seem to focus on helping people do systems thinking. We don't look at the higher orders of thinking, such as Janusian thinking or Hegelian thinking. And we're finding that when we start down in the primary grades with 6- and 7-year-old kids and let them discover Janusian and Hegelian thinking, they greatly accelerate their own learning.
Mm-hmm.
That's really interesting. You know, these are the kinds of insights I think that can come from a field like education and inform the fundamental architecture of a cyber-social learning system for defense or for some other vastly different field of application. So I would point back to the slides. I don't see the number right offhand on greatly expanded theories of learning for cyber-social systems, and I would probably plug in these insights right into those slides right there.
Well, it starts on slide 20.
Starts on slide 20, and let me, I would also point to, let's see if I can, slide 37, 38, and 39.
Yes. And I'll offer on slide 40 that some people in Kansas know now how to accelerate the growth of different kinds of neural nets in the human brain. We can, in fact, create more and better thinkers.
Yeah, if you look at let's see, did I leave this in my slides? I skipped over a little bit because we started a little bit late. On slide 38, the second sub-bullet, there's a wide chasm between understanding microprocesses like neural firing or growth and making good life decisions. So I think a broad theory, this, by the way, is from Gary Marcianoni, an expert in education. What are the analogs of this sort of span of mechanisms and considerations for a cyber-social learning system? You know, everything from energy flows and neural growth to, you know, wise decisions for the long-term future of a society.
And my sense is that right now, people are way too focused on systems thinking as the thing to do, and are not considering other kinds of thinking.
Well, it would be really interesting to ask, you know, how do we build a platform that and a culture, if you will, that begins to encourage this kind of cross-disciplinary integration of insight and expertise. Because again, we're not going to be able to do this from within our own disciplines. Everyone is too narrow.
And again, thanks for everyone for sticking around for this great discussion. There's a little bit more information at the tail end of the slides, but just continuing the conversation from the Q&A, Daniel Appel said, would you consider it excessively reductionist to look at the ability to sense, adapt, and evolve with context environment changes as part of the overhead in the traditional sense, or is it probably an outdated construct as well? And then also followed up with Jack Ring's explanation, I've heard as its own chaotic systems is a big part of why that is interesting to me, the same immune system talk as well, with the downside that the analogs of autoimmune responses will be just as debilitating.
Well, let's see. If I understood the first part of the question, I don't believe that that style of evolutionary thinking is obsolete at all. You know, I think that what we need to be looking at is what sort of mechanisms will enable the construction of systems that, you know, can, you know, learn how to perform at extraordinary levels of fitness for purpose in evolving and very complex environments. So if I understood the question, I think that that's sort of fundamental to what we're contemplating here. And really thinking about that not as something that's easy to do, but something that historically, at least for the systems we really care about, has been extraordinarily difficult. Look at procurement and how fast it's learning to do better. Look at healthcare delivery and how fast it's learning to do better. These systems are all so preoccupied with operational efficiency at the present moment that this kind of exploration, exploitation involves almost all exploitation and no exploration. There's very little learning. There's very little improvement in system performance. And as I said, in many cases, it's actually going backwards.
Well, Jack Ring here, I suggest that one of the kinds of things that might be useful is the chaotic organization ideas that D. Hawk wrote his book about a few years back, The Birth of the Chaotic Age. When you look at the architecture for such a human organization, it seems to serve most everything that you have talked about today, except for one thing. D. Hawk concluded that there aren't hardly any human beings with the courage to do this.
Yeah, I guess that also gets into complex adaptive systems and the role of incentive structures in getting people to converge on better solutions to things.
Yep. Yeah, I think we can also use taxonomies of kind of different circumstances in which there are different balances between chaos and order. I mean, in the most chaotic systems, nothing is predictable at all, and so you might as well not try to learn because it won't happen. In fact, we had one person in the workshop who looked at, the predictability of future disease outbreaks as based on data from the past, and what he found was that the more data you had, the less prediction you could do. That essentially the entropy increased with accumulating data, suggesting that there's basically no long-term patterns. On the other hand, in a traditional engineering environment, a lot is predictable. And so we really need to understand where we are in that sort of order versus chaos in that entropy space in order to select appropriate strategies for learning and improving, for coping. Now, it may be that Visa, found itself in a particular spot in that space, and that led to these insights into sort of chaotic organization.
Okay, we're about 20 minutes over, and I know our discussion could probably keep continuing. But just to be respectful of everyone's time, again, Kevin, thank you so much for presenting, and your information is available for anybody who'd like to follow up and continue the discussion. Okay,
you're welcome. It's my honor to be presenting in this forum with the very distinguished colleagues whose names surround mine on the agenda. And apologize, we got started a few minutes late, so I was a little bit over at the end, and we ran over a little bit. But thank you all for being here, and please feel free to contact me, talk with me, and I will connect you into the evolving community of people who are thinking about these ideas and the future of systems. Thank you very much.
Okay,
by far the most valuable hour.
It's been really stimulating, informative, and extremely important. So thanks again. Bye.
Thank you very much, Barry.
I'd like to see you in person. It's the registration's open for the SERC annual event, so we can discuss live in DC on November 7th and 8th. And just a quick look at our talks coming up. It's the start of the cybersecurity series, August 2nd, with the second in the series being October 4th with Dr. Barry Horowitz and Dr. Gary McGraw. So again, thank you everyone for joining us, and please stay posted. The video will be sent out by Friday to all participants, so anyone who wasn't able to stick around for the extended version, if you will be able to see it then. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Mimi.
Thank you, Mimi. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Okay, bye, everybody.